The jeep skidded to a stop in the sand. General George S. Patton stepped out, his boots hitting the North African dirt with a hard crack. Around him, the wreckage of American equipment stretched for miles. Burned-out tanks, shattered artillery pieces, supply trucks flipped on their sides like toys thrown by an angry child. The smell of charred metal and diesel hung heavy in the dry desert air. This was Kasserine Pass, and what Patton was looking at was a disaster. It was March 1943. The United States Army had been in North Africa for only a few months. They came in confident, they came in loud. They believed their equipment was superior, their numbers were strong, and their enemy was already weakened from years of fighting the British. They were wrong. What happened at Kasserine Pass shook the American military to its core. In just a matter of days, German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had torn through American lines like paper. Over 6,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Hundreds of vehicles were destroyed. Entire units collapsed and ran. The press called it a humiliation. Military historians would later call it the most embarrassing American defeat of the entire war. And now Patton was standing in the middle of it, trying to understand what went wrong. He walked to the ground slowly. He studied every burned vehicle. He asked survivors what they saw, what they heard, where the Germans came from. He looked at the terrain with cold, calculating eyes. This was not grief. This was not anger. This was something sharper. This was a man trying to understand his enemy. Because Patton knew something the newspapers didn't say out loud. The problem at Kasserine was not just poor tactics or bad equipment. The problem was that the Americans had faced Erwin Rommel, and they had not been ready for what that meant. Rommel was not like other generals. He did not sit in a comfortable headquarters miles behind the front lines, moving pieces on a map and waiting for reports. He was forward. He was fast. He made decisions in minutes that other commanders took hours to reach. He changed direction without warning. He attacked where the enemy was weak, avoided where they were strong, and moved so quickly that his own men sometimes couldn't keep up with him. His soldiers called him the Desert Fox, not as a nickname someone invented in a press office. It was earned. In the desert, a fox survives by being faster, smarter, and more unpredictable than everything hunting it. Rommel had been fighting in North Africa since 1941. By the time the Americans arrived, he had humiliated the British multiple times. He had captured Tobruk, a fortress the British swore could never fall. He had pushed all the way to El Alamein in Egypt, within striking distance of the Suez Canal. Winston Churchill said that losing Tobruk was one of the most painful moments of the entire war. And yet, most Americans had not taken this man seriously. There was arrogance inside the early American command structure, the feeling that European armies, even the Germans, were fighting a different kind of war, a slower war, and that when American industrial power and American fighting spirit entered the picture, the math would simply change. Kasserine proved that math was wrong. Patton stood at the pass and looked north, toward the ridgeline where Rommel's armor had come pouring through. He tried to see what Rommel had seen when he planned this attack: the narrow pass, the elevated ground on both sides, the limited American ability to maneuver once engaged, the supply lines that stretched too far with too little protection. Rommel had read this terrain like a page in a book. He struck at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right force, in exactly the right direction. He knew the Americans were green. He knew their officers were inexperienced. He knew that chaos and surprise would do half his work for him. And he was right. Patton was not the kind of man who admitted mistakes easily. His entire personality was built around confidence, aggression, and the iron belief that willpower could overcome almost anything. But standing at Kasserine, he did something rare for a man of his character. He listened to the ground.
He picked up intelligence reports and read them carefully, something he had not always done with patience before. He looked at Rommel's movement patterns going back 2 years. He studied how the German general reacted to pressure, how he exploited hesitation, how he fed on the fear of opponents who played defense instead of offense. And slowly, something crystallized in Patton's mind. Rommel was dangerous, not simply because he was skilled. Rommel was dangerous because he thought faster than his enemies expected. He operated at a speed that traditional commanders couldn't process in real time. By the time an American unit radioed for orders and waited for a response, Rommel had already changed the situation 3 times. The Americans had been reacting to him, and you cannot win by reacting to Rommel. You had to act. You had to force him to react to you. This was the lesson, and it would change everything about how Patton approached the rest of the campaign. He took command of 2nd Corps in early March 1943, 2 weeks after Kasserine. The unit was demoralized and disorganized. Soldiers were exhausted. Officers were shaken. The confidence that had carried American forces into North Africa was gone, replaced by something quieter and darker. Patton walked into that atmosphere like a thunderstorm. He immediately issued orders that seemed almost petty given the scale of the crisis. Uniforms had to be proper, helmets had to be worn at all times, soldiers had to be shaved, junior officers were fined on the spot for dress code violations. Men grumbled, some thought their new commander had lost his mind. But Patton understood something about soldiers that most academics miss. Discipline is not about appearance. Discipline is about the mental habit of doing what is required, even when you don't want to. A soldier who shaves every morning, even in the middle of a desert campaign, is a soldier who is practicing the same mental muscle he will need when the shells start falling and his instincts tell him to run. Discipline builds the reflex to follow orders instead of panic. He was rebuilding their identity as soldiers, one small rule at a time. Then he changed the tempo. He launched 2nd Corps into action almost immediately, not reckless charges, calculated pressure. He attacked at El Guetar in late March 1943, pushing into territory that German and Italian forces held with confidence. They expected the Americans to be hesitant after Kasserine. They expected caution. They expected the defensive crouch of a beaten army. What they got was something different. American armor pushed into the valley at El Guetar at dawn. The 1st Infantry Division moved with a precision that had not been seen from American forces in this theater before. And when the German 10th Panzer Division counterattacked, they ran into carefully prepared anti-tank positions that tore through the assault. It was not a perfect battle. Nothing in war is perfect. The Americans took serious casualties. Progress was slow and painful, but for the first time, American forces held their ground against a major German armored counterattack. Word spread quickly through the command structure. The Americans had not broken. This mattered more than the territory gained. Rommel himself, by this point, was already leaving North Africa. His health was failing, and he had been recalled to Germany before the final collapse of Axis forces in Tunisia. But his influence was still present in every German commander who followed his methods, in every tactic that bore his fingerprints, and Patton was learning to counter it. He began to think about speed differently. American commanders had been using speed as a concept, talking about it in briefings and writing it into orders. Patton turned it into a physical reality. He pushed supply lines harder. He demanded that units move faster than they thought possible. He accepted that some things would break and some men would be exhausted because the cost of slowness was higher than the cost of exhaustion.
He was becoming, in some ways, a mirror image of Rommel. Not a copy. Patton had his own style, his own aggression, his own way of seeing the battlefield, but he had absorbed the essential truth that Rommel had been demonstrating for 2 years. The commander who moves faster, decides faster, and acts faster owns the battle. The commander who waits, consults, and hesitates
hands the initiative to his enemy. There is a moment, recorded by officers who were present, when Patton was looking at a map in Tunisia, and someone on his staff asked about a planned German defensive line. Patton looked at the map for a long moment. Then he said quietly that Rommel would not defend that line. He would already be somewhere else. It was the observation of a man who had truly studied his adversary. Not just his tactics, but his mind, his instincts, the way he saw problems and space and time on a battlefield. Rommel was always somewhere else before you expected him to be. And Patton was now trying to train himself to think the same way, so that when he eventually faced commanders who had learned from Rommel's school, he would be ready. The stakes of this learning could not have been higher. The war in North Africa was ending, but a much larger campaign was coming. Sicily, then Italy, then eventually the massive cross-channel invasion that American and British planners had been building toward since 1942. In each of those campaigns, Patton would face German commanders who had absorbed the same doctrine of speed and aggression that Rommel had perfected. The question was whether American leadership had grown fast enough to match them. At Kasserine, the answer had been no. By the end of Tunisia, it was becoming something closer to yes. It was worth taking a moment to understand what Rommel actually represented, because it is easy to reduce him to a villain or a myth, and both of those make him harder to understand. Rommel was a professional soldier of extraordinary talent who had risen from relative obscurity because of a single characteristic. He was willing to take risks that other commanders would never accept because he calculated those risks faster and with greater accuracy than almost anyone around him. He had done it in France in 1940, racing his Panzer division so far ahead of German lines that even his own superiors occasionally ordered him to stop because they didn't know where he was. He had done it in North Africa, attacking when his supply situation seemed to make attack impossible, winning battles that by conventional logic should have been defeats. He did not always win. He was stopped at El Alamein, he lost Tunisia, his campaigns in North Africa ultimately failed. But the method he demonstrated, the integration of speed, deception, and aggressive forward leadership, had changed how modern armies fought. American commanders who understood this walked away from North Africa with something more valuable than territory. They walked away with a doctrine, an understanding, a new way of thinking about momentum in warfare. Patton carried that understanding into Sicily in July 1943. And in Sicily he ran. His 7th Army swept across the western half of the island with a speed that left German defenders scrambling. He took Palermo in 11 days. He raced Bernard Montgomery to Messina and won. It was the campaign that made him a legend, and it was built on the foundation of what he had learned staring at the wreckage of Kasserine. He had learned to think like the enemy he feared most. There is something deeply human in that story. A general who walked into North Africa believing his instincts were enough, who faced disaster, who stood in the ruins and asked himself an honest question about what he didn't understand, and who used the answer to rebuild himself into something more dangerous. Patton was never humble in the conventional sense. His ego was a force of nature that caused serious problems throughout his career. But at Kasserine, he was humble in the most important way a soldier can be. He admitted to himself that he had underestimated his enemy, and then he did something about it. That willingness to learn, to be changed by hard experience rather than hardened against it, is what separated the commanders who grew during the war from those who were replaced and forgotten. The soldiers who fought under Patton in France in 1944, racing across the countryside with the Third Army in the weeks after the Normandy breakout, were experiencing the final product of that education. The speed was Patton, but the understanding of why speed mattered and how to use it as a weapon rather than just a preference, that came from the desert. That came from Kasserine. That came from Rommel. History remembers great enemies as obstacles, But sometimes the enemy teaches you something you could never have learned from a friend. Rommel taught the American army how to fight a different kind of war. He did it the hard way, by beating them badly enough that they had no choice but to change. And the man who absorbed that lesson most deeply, who walked the broken ground of Kasserine and came away sharpened rather than broken, went on to lead one of the most aggressive and effective armored campaigns in the history of the Second World War. The defeated men at Kasserine Pass and the veterans who raced across France with Patton in 1944 were the same army. What changed was the education, and the teacher, in his brutal and indirect way, was Erwin Rommel. There is a question worth sitting with if you're the kind of person who thinks about leadership and war and the cost of underestimating a serious enemy. How often do we look at a defeat and actually ask what we failed to understand? Not who to blame, not what went wrong tactically, but what we fundamentally misread about the challenge we were facing. Patton asked that question in the North African sand in March 1943, and the answer he found changed the war. Drop your thoughts below. Who do you think was the more dangerous mind, Patton or Rommel? And do you think Kasserine was the moment that truly made Patton the general history remembers?